When I began this series, I said that I really don't think you can have a full understanding of the Bible unless you understand it chronologically, the events that happen chronologically and covenantally. That is, the covenants that God made, 7 of them, with His creation. Now, it's very important that you understand this as we go into tonight's lesson. All right, in the first lesson, we talked about, the first and second lessons, we talked about the Edenic Covenant. God created the world and the covenant that He made with man, or with Adam and Eve in Eden. And then in the second lesson, we talked about the Abrahamic Covenant, which God made in chapter 3 of Genesis with Adam after the sin, after the fall. And then we had the flood, and then last week we talked about the Noahic covenant that God made with Noah in chapters 8 and 9, and that's where we left off. Now, in chapter 12, we're going to talk about the next covenant, which is the Abrahamic Covenant, and that we will talk about next week. But before we get to the Abrahamic Covenant, you got to go through chapter 10 and chapter 11, which is a consequence of chapter 10. And in chapter 10, as I told you last week, it's one of those chapters like when we start reading the one-year Bible, or you make the commitment to read the Bible through in a year and you get to chapter 10 and you just skip through it really quickly because it's a genealogy for the most part, and it's 70 names, 70, that don't seem to have any relevance to us today, and yet it has tremendous relevance to us today, and I'm going to try to describe why tonight. Now, you also need to understand this. The first 11 chapters, the 11th chapter is going to be the Tower of Babel, that we will refer to next week a little bit. But the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis cover a span of over 2,000 years. You got that? From the creation to the Tower of Babel, the first 11 chapters of Genesis cover a span of over 2,000 years. Then when we pick up with the Abrahamic Covenant, which we will next week in chapter 12, from Abraham to Joseph, chapters 12 to chapter 50 in Genesis covers about 250 years. So you're talking about a division. This is a pretty big area of division between chapter 11 and 12. And at first glance, chapter 10 doesn't seem to offer much promise as a lesson, to be honest. It appears to just be another biblical genealogy. But in reality, it's very different. Very, very different. So don't just skip through these 70 names that are given here. The most obvious question to ask is, what in the world is going on here? You go from all this excitement of, and you know, Moses wrote the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We think he wrote this chapter near the end of his life, chapter 10. And so you go, what in the world is happening here? You go from the creation and then to the fall of man and sin, and then you go to God's disgust with mankind in chapters 5 and 6, and then the flood, and then the Noahic covenant, and then you're going to go to the Tower of Babel in chapter 11, and then you're going to go to the story of Abraham, begins in chapter 12. And why in the middle of all that here in chapter 10 do we just suddenly pause? And we get a genealogy covering all these names. Not only why, but who cares? I mean, seriously, what difference does it make? Well, it makes an enormous difference, and I hope to show you tonight. And it begins in verse 1. This is the account of the families of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the 3 sons of Noah. Many children were born to them after the great flood. The first verse in chapter 10 is the key to everything else. If we take Genesis chapter 9 and chapter 10 literally, as I think we should, then after the flood, there were only 8 people living on earth. Noah, his wife, Noah's 3 sons and their wives. And from those 8 people came the entire population of the world. And the reason why Genesis chapter 10 is so important is because it tells us how it happened. It's going to tell us about the descendants of Japheth and Ham and Shem and where they went. In fact, the last verse of Genesis chapter 10 says, these are the clans that descended from Noah's sons, arranged by nation according to their lines of ascent. Theologians have called this, theologians I should say, have called this the table of nations. And that's exactly what it is. So Genesis chapter 10 describes what happened when Noah and his family left the ark and reestablished civilization. The 3 sons moved in 3 very different directions with 3 very different clans that developed. They had children, their children had children, their children's children had children, and over the years, their descendants formed families, tribes, clans, all that descended from Noah's sons. Alliances were formed between some of these different descendants of Noah's 3 sons. Some were friendly to Israel. Others were bitter enemies of Israel, God's chosen people. Others never knew them. And they're sort of irrelevant, by the way, here to Genesis chapter 10. They're not mentioned very much. Because the point that Moses is making is, I need God's people, the Jews, to understand where you all came from, where your enemies and your allies came from, and how God established all that. So, if some people were sort of irrelevant to Israel's existence, their name is either mentioned or maybe not even mentioned here, with very little emphasis. That's also why the most space is given. 15 verses in this passage are given to the descendants of Ham, because the descendants of Ham were going to be people that God's people, the Israelites, were going to have to deal with for generations. So Moses wrote Genesis chapter 10 sometime near the end of his life, and it serves as sort of a written map to help the Jews as they entered the promised land understand the various nations and cultures around them. Understand the nations that were already there. And the most attention is given to the Hamites because they're the ones that were going to have Israel dealing with them. For instance, Genesis chapter 9 said Shem and Japheth took a robe, held it over their shoulders, backed into the tent to cover their father, Noah. As they did this, they looked the other way so they would not see him naked. And when Noah woke up from his stupor, he learned what Ham, his youngest son, had done. Then he cursed Canaan, the son of Ham. Canaan is going to become one of the nations and families or clans that become the Canaanites. And he said, may Canaan be cursed, may he be the lowest of servants to his relatives. And Noah said, may the Lord, the God of Shem, Shem's descendants are going to become the Israelites, among others. May the Lord, the God of Shem, be blessed, and may Canaan be his servant. And so the Canaanites lived in the land that God had promised or was going to promise to Abraham and his descendants. And this chapter would help the Jews understand why they had to annihilate the Canaanites without mercy. This is very important to a full understanding of the Bible, because sometimes people say, well, I just can't believe in a God that allowed the Israelites to go into the land and take those people away and kill them without mercy and destroy all of them and even destroy their children. It's a part of this promise. It's a part of this reality. It's a part of these nations and cultures. One other point before we move on. Since Moses wrote Genesis 10 for a particular generation of Jewish readers, it's obviously very selective in nature. For instance, Japheth had 7 sons, but Moses only mentions the descendants of 2 sons, Gomer and Javan. That's the only 2 he's going to mention. The reason is because those are the tribes that were critical for the Jews to know about. So what we have then in Genesis chapter 10 is a selective but accurate account of the nations in and around the Promised Land during the time of the conquest under Joshua, the Israelites taking the Promised Land. I think an illustration might help. How many of you have ever played the board game Risk? Raise your hand if you've ever played the board game Risk. All right, this may help you then. If you have, you know that it contains a large map of the world, and the object of the game is simple: defeat all the other players and end up ruling the world. And each player is given armies of a different color: green and red and blue and gray and yellow. And each player is given different colors, and at the beginning of the game, they put their armies in certain countries or regions on the board. And so when all the armies are in place, the game can begin. But there's a moment, and it happens in every game, that there's a pause right before the game actually begins where everybody studies the board to see the alignment of forces. And they say something like, you know, he's really strong in Africa. I bet he's going to make a play for Europe. Or somebody says, you know, he's really strong in the United States, so I bet he's going to make a play for South America or for North America. And there's that point where everybody pauses and looks at the board before the fighting begins, and then someone rolls the dice, and then the armies go into battle. Genesis 10 is like that moment where all the people of the world have been placed in their nations, the table of nations. And all these cultures are set, especially around the Holy Land. And that's the way the world looks before the game begins. And I'll just say this as a side too. Those who have studied this chapter in detail remark on its amazing historical accuracy with what we know thousands of years later about cultures and societies. And it really also reveals the genius of the Hebrew mind and gives us a peek behind the curtain of early world history. And let me also just say this with force. If we didn't have Genesis chapter 10, we wouldn't know much about early world history. Because we don't have these kinds of accounts from any other type of historians that go back 2,000 years plus before the time of Christ. We don't. And so this is literally World History 101 as taught by Moses, who was inspired by God himself through the Holy Spirit. And here's something else. All of us can learn something from this and have it be important to us because guess what? This is where we all came from. This is our family tree. We are all in here somewhere. In fact, Martin Luther said, commenting on this chapter, look into the historical counts of all nations. If it were not for Moses alone, what would you know about the origins and early history of man? The answer to that is nothing. So literally, Genesis chapter 10 is sort of a primer on world history and even our own family tree. It starts in verses 2 through 5 with the descendants of Japheth. And these verses list 14 names, and they're all on the screen. And I'm not going to read them all or read the whole text because you have it in front of you. After the flood, the descendants of Japheth spread out to the north and to the west of the Middle East. Gomer, who's one of two sons of Japheth that is mentioned, lived in the region north of the Black Sea. Madal became the father of the Medes. Javan, another one mentioned, founded the tribes living in Greece. Meshach and Tubal settled in Russia. One branch of Japheth's family moved east and settled in the region of India. So you have the descendants of Japheth stretching from India through Russia, across the Mediterranean Sea, northward into Europe and Scandinavia. And linguists, even today, will tell you that there are amazing similarities in the speech between these peoples in these countries of Europe and in Iran and Iraq and India. To the point they believe there was one common language at one time. Verse 5 says, Japheth's descendants became the seafaring peoples that spread out to various lands, each identified by its own language, clan, and national identity. Now, less is said about the descendants of Japheth because they lived in regions that were very remote to the promised land, and they were going to have very little to do with the battles that took place around the promised land and still do. They were going to have very little to do with that until the spread of Christianity in the first century. And then the Japhethites will come back in and figure prominently in the book of Acts and in the epistles in the spread of early New Testament Christianity. Then there are the descendants of Ham. And more verses are given to them and more names listed for them than any other of Noah's sons. They're listed in verses 6 through 20, and it lists 30 names. After the flood, Genesis 10 says the Hamites moved south and west. Ham's four sons were Cush, that's Ethiopia, Mizraim, that's Egypt, Put, that's Libya, and Canaan refers to the Holy Land, the land of Israel, the Canaanites. In fact, verses 8 and 9 are going to describe one of those Canaanites, who we're going to talk about in a little more depth next week over in chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. Cush was also the ancestor of Nimrod. Nimrod, who was the first heroic warrior on earth. Since he was the greatest hunter in the world, his name became proverbial. People would say, this man is like Nimrod, the greatest hunter in the world. Nimrod is also going to lead the rebellion against God at Babel that we will look at next week. Nimrod founded Babel, later to become Babylonia, and Nineveh, later to become the capital of the Assyrian Empire. You know, if you know anything about Old Testament history, that the Assyrians and the Babylonians were the biggest enemies of God's people, the Israelites, for hundreds of years. They were the descendants of Ham and particularly of Nimrod. Verses 15 through 18, I'm not going to read, but it mentions the various Canaanite tribes that when you get to Joshua and the Israelites conquering the promised land, we see a lot of them. The Amorites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and so on. These were the people Joshua and his followers had to fight when they entered the Holy Land. Also, the Hittites migrated east and settled in the region of western China. There's extensive evidence today that these people became part of the Assyrian Empire and that they were a part of the first people in the early settlements of China. You can look all this up if it's interesting to you. I don't want to spend any more time with it than I have to because I want to get to the applications of all this. But many people have speculated that a branch of the Hamite people crossed the ancient land bridge at the Bering Strait between Russia and Alaska, becoming the first settlers of North America, where we're sitting, and South America. It is believed that they probably were the descendants of the Aztec tribes and the Mayan people who descended from Ham. It's absolutely indisputable that the Hamites founded the first great world empires, the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. You read about both of these. You read about so much in the Bible: the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Sumerians, and the Hittites, and probably again the Aztecs as well. One other note about these Canaanite tribes: the Canaanite clans eventually spread out, and the territory of Canaan extended from Sidon in the north to Gerar and Gaza. You still hear that phrase today in the south. And east as far as Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim near Lasha. So they prospered for a long, long time. The descendants of Ham did. That leads us to the descendants of Shem. And this section is going to list 26 names. And from Shem comes the Assyrians, the Hebrews, some of the Arab tribes, and tribes that lived in parts of Turkey and Syria and Armenia. This is, of course, the Israelites also descended from them. In fact, the modern term Semitic, you hear all the time, Semitic or anti-Semitic, you hear practically every week in the news. That simply means descendants of Shem. The name Peleg in verse 25 means divided, because in these days the earth was going to be divided. That refers to the division of languages that's going to take place over here in chapter 11. By far, the most important fact to know about Shem is that he is the one that was prophesied in the Adamic Covenant in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that the seed of woman will bruise the head of the serpent. The serpent will strike the heel, but the seed of woman will bruise the head of Satan. That's a direct reference to Shem. The Messiah will be his direct descendant. In other words, this prophecy becomes fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So, you could say that a condensed genealogy, a very, very, very condensed genealogy, is Adam, Noah, Shem, Abraham, Jesus Christ, and I should have put this on there, you and me. You and me. The reason why Genesis chapter 10 is so important, you're in it. If you're a Bible believer, you're in it. Now, by the end of Genesis chapter 10, the human race is hopelessly divided between this bewildering variety of tribes, clans, nations, and empires, separated from one another and separated from God. But even while rebellious human beings continued to separate from each other, God is going, this is the beauty of this, God is going to continue to keep his promise and his covenant going across the generations. Wow. So I just find it fascinating to study this chapter, if for no other reason from the standpoint of history and geography, to see God's hand at work in all these nations. I mean, to me, that's just fascinating. But I'm still convinced there's some of you sitting out there or watching on screen saying, who cares? Well, we should. And I'm going to spend the last few minutes telling you the enormous reasons why. Because Genesis chapter 10 shows the incredible unity of the human race. After the flood, everyone on earth is descended from one of these three men, Japheth, Shem, or Ham. And that includes all 6.4 billion people who presently live on planet Earth. We all descend from these three sons of Noah. What does that mean? That means the human race, as we see it today, is incredibly diverse in geography and language and culture and skin color and physical capabilities and dress and habits and diet and interest and so on. But those differences, as vast as they are, and we're reminded of them every single day in our society, are not the final truth. They're not. We are all branches from the same family tree, and each person is related to every other person on earth in this way. And here's the proof. I mean, I could give you dozens of proof, but let me give you the most simple one because it's going to play into some verses I'm going to use. You can take the blood of an Irishman and transfuse it into the body of a woman from Japan, and his blood will save her life. Or you can take the blood of a woman in Japan and transfuse it into the body of a man from Brazil, and her blood will save his life. Researchers tell us that human DNA is so stable that you can take two people from any place on earth and their DNA will be 99.88% the same. Did you get that? And of that 12/100ths of 1% that is different, 11/100ths of that has absolutely nothing to do with the color of your skin or the color of your eyes or the shape of your face or anything else like that. Now let that sink in for just a minute. That means that the so-called racial differences, which seem so important to so many people, are absolutely trivial to the point of total insignificance if you are a Bible believer. In fact, Revelation 7:9 says about heaven, I saw a vast crowd too great to count, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing in front of the throne and before the Lamb. Remember back when we were reading Genesis chapter 10, verse 32, and it used the word clan. The word clan and tribe can be used interchangeably. Genesis chapter 10 is important because it reminds us of the unity of the human race, and what an humbling truth this is. Hitler's mistake was to think that one race could be superior to another race. That's why he was trying to create the Aryan race and wound up killing approximately 12 million Jews and Russians and Ukrainians. So this means, Genesis chapter 10 means, the worst person on earth is my brother, part of my family tree. And one of the ways we usually deny that is by trying to use demeaning terms to attack one another and insults and stereotypes that lift us up and put others down. But let me say two things very clearly about that. First of all, that's ignorant. And secondly, that's anti-biblical. That's anti-biblical. You can't have it both ways. You cannot say you're a Bible believer and not say that we all came from the same 8 people. Therefore, there's amazing unity in the human race. Have any of you ever done this Ancestry.com or 23andMe? How many of you have? Well, you can raise your hand. I know you have. Because last year or a couple years ago for Christmas, Diane and I decided to do it for one another. And it's very interesting what you learn. For instance, I learned I'm 1.2% African Congolese. That's right in the heart of Africa. I am 0.9% Native American. I could say that in relation to certain political candidates, but I won't. I'll just say I have more. But anyway, all I'm saying is, how could I say of anybody else anything about their ethnicity? We are all in the same human family. If you're a Bible believer, Genesis 10 teaches that. But we're all in the same blood family. I mean, if I don't get you in the brotherhood of Christ or in the blood of Christ, I get you in the brotherhood of man or in the blood of man. Because there's only one blood type. Human. It's easy to grow narrow and provincial and to just say us four and no more, just my kind, just my color, just my language, just my people, just my background, just my traditions, just my preferences. And pretty soon you end up with a church just with you and nobody else. If we have narrow visions and small ideas and exclusive claims that we are better than other people because of our heritage or our background or our skin color, then we simply do not understand the gospel and the biblical message. We don't. Paul said this on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. God has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. You know what that's a reference to? Genesis chapter 10. What we just read. You know what that's a reference to? You ain't special. Neither am I. There is no such thing as American blood. There's no such thing as French blood. There's no such thing as German blood. There is no such thing as African blood. There is no such thing as Jewish blood. There is no such thing as Russian or Chinan blood. There is only one blood, human blood. Flows in all kinds of varieties. But it is all one blood. And so the theory of racial superiority has led to horrible results anywhere it has shown up in history. I mean, nearly a century ago, I mentioned the Nazis. In our own country, the belief in white superiority fueled slavery and segregation and the Jim Crow laws. It still causes people to hate people of a different color, of a different mindset, of a different background, and of a different tradition. And it is simply not of God. And it is simply not biblical. So this is why Genesis chapter 10, my friends, is so important. It's God's funnel. You know what a funnel is, don't you? A funnel is broad based up here and then it's very tiny. And Genesis chapter 10 is God's funnel of the human race, showing us that we all flow from a wide area into a very small area. The line that started with Adam goes to Noah, then to Shem, then eventually to Abraham, and thousands of years later climaxes with the blood of Jesus Christ on Calvary. The flow of the biblical story of many nations goes from one man, Adam, who because of his sin infected all of God's creation, including us, down to Jesus Christ. But it has to go through Abraham, which is next week's topic in the Abrahamic Covenant, starting in Genesis chapter 12. And how will this blessing come to you and me and to everybody else? Through ultimately the seed or the descendants of Abraham will come the Lord Jesus Christ. That's why Genesis chapter 10 is not like any of the other genealogies when you get over into Leviticus and Deuteronomy, or as you go further through early and later Hebrew history. It's different because it's a picture of you and me too, and how we get to Christ. And it reminds us of the amazing unity of the human race and the one blood that saves us all.